Okay, hello everyone. I think we're almost complete. Thank you for coming back after the break. So the plan, what we're going to do now is we're going to have a policy fellow panel discussion. We have a large group, or a nice group of fellows and their supervisors, if that's the correct term, from Defra, BEIS and Welsh Government, and I will be asking them various questions to reflect on their perspectives and opinions, and then we'll hand over to the audience after that. But before we start doing that, so I'll ask them to come to the front here in a little while. I'm sure they'll be delighted to sit here. Before we do that, I just wanted to quickly say a little bit about what this means from an access perspective, and then I will hand over to Paul, who's going to say something about this from an ESRC perspective. Daniel. How did I say Paul? Sorry, I've heard so many names. You look like a Paul. No, Daniel. Right, so... Oh. Which button do I... Oh, there we go. So the aim of the session really is to provide a space for conversation, reflection, mutual learning on what makes a successful policy fellowship. So we have the experts here to try and find out what it is that they have experienced so far. Hopefully we'll get some juicy details and some honest discussions. And it fits really nicely, of course, with what we talked about in the previous section as well, about how do we do co-production, how do we work together, how do we learn from each other, things like that. So the key questions that we wanted to address is something along the lines of what does a social science impact, what does it look like from each side's the perspective of each side, what are the challenges and the opportunities involved with social science, knowledge, insights, and when insight and data is brought to bear inside government. So what does that mean? How does it work? What are the challenges and opportunities that are associated with that? And so some of these things will come back. So this is our panel. So this is the timing, very detailed timing. And we've got Saffron sitting there with her flappy, make sure that we stick to the timing. Yeah, so it's really exciting. So you can see here, I've got quite a few names from different places. So we'll have a really nice and interesting discussion. I will start asking some questions first, and after that, I will hand obviously over to you as well, so you can have a Q&A with the audience as well. Just very briefly say something about access. So. Obviously, one of the overarching aims of access is to strengthen the perceived value of environmental social science in research, in teaching, in policy, and practice. And by that I don't just mean the academic social science into policy and practice. I mean it in all the different directions that you can possibly think of. And of course, in order to work on that, in order to improve that, in order to champion environmental social science, we do have to work with different stakeholders. So this is part of what we're doing today, and this is what we're going to be doing over the next 5 years. We have a lot of activities throughout access, and part of our work package 2, which is all about capacity building. We will also be looking at placements. At the moment, we've built in short placements, which are, the idea of them are mutual placements. So academics going into policy. I use policy in the biggest possible way you can imagine it, but also the other way around. We're really, really keen that it goes both ways. We have, of course, our summer schools. We have our ECR college. We have a mentoring scheme, etc., etc. And really what we want to do is build that capacity for the future generation of academics and non-academic interdisciplinary environmental social scientists. So that's really a key, strong part of what we hope to achieve in access. So learning from the policy fellows and the discussion that we're going to have this morning is going to be really exciting for me. I'm very excited. But first I'm going to hand over to Daniel. Daniel Robertson, who's the head of policy partnerships and impact in the ESRC and has the perspective of ESRC to share with us.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, gosh, I would. Brilliant. Thank you. Am I pressing the right button? How do I make the slides? I see. Oh, cutting. Right. Brilliant. Thank you. To paraphrase Oscar Wilde, sorry I wrote a long PowerPoint presentation. I didn't have the time to do a short one. What I will do, though, there are a few slides in here which I think you probably don't need me to talk through, so I will skip over quite quickly. But if I do go through something too fast, do say, "Oi, Robinson, stop," and I will, and we can explain things in a bit more detail. So I've been asked to say within 5 minutes, and counting down quite rapidly, I imagine. Why ESRC is interested in fellowships, why we're supporting the policy fellowships call, and indeed why this is likely to become an even larger part of our activities moving forward. So I'm not going to go through this. Do most people know who ESRC or what ESRC is and does? Yep, cool. That's all good. We have a new delivery plan. It's so new you won't have even seen it yet because it's not been published. It doesn't. It's probably we're aiming for about now. I think it's going to be coming out in September. But in that is this sort of vision around finding solutions for a more prosperous, healthy, and sustainable and secure society. In a bit more detail, it looks like this. This is. Again, this is so hot off the press it hasn't even been printed yet. So this is our delivery plan, which is going to be coming out to September time. What has come out and what you can already read if you are looking for a non-stop rollercoaster ride of strategic discovery is the UKRI strategy for 2022 to 27. And as you can see, our world-class commitments are there, and the ESRC delivery plan will connect into those. It's possible this might change slightly between now and when it's officially published, but I think this is not likely to be much. And as you can see under impacts, we have right at the top net zero, environment and climate change. So that's why there's a specific interest and connection to access. But also, again, more broadly, what we're looking at under because all of these is impact around engagement, around collaboration, and around policy. So if you read through the UKRI strategy, and again the delivery plan when it is published, you'll see that engaging with policymakers is very prominent in both documents, but particularly the ESRC plan. Yeah, that's it. So a little bit about what are some of the drivers. This isn't an exhaustive list, but we're seeing an increasingly high demand and need for evidence from local, devolved and UK national policy communities. Lots of reasons for this. I think one of the more obvious recent drivers is probably COVID. Again, that recognition that there is a need for scientific evidence and expertise in policy making. There's a growing focus on the impact and knowledge exchange. So obviously engaging with policymakers is potentially one route by which the research that we support through funding that you do can have an impact through engagement with policymakers. There's increasing area of interest for diverse funders in the UK and beyond. So I'm part of a network, the Transforming Evidence Funders Network, mainly North American, Canadian. Very interested in knowledge exchange and engagement, looking not just at research use, but this is where I guess properly meta research on research use, and that's again is something that we're likely to be exploring more in the future, really trying to develop that understanding of what actually does make for effective use of research in policy. And again, I mean, it's worth saying, I mean, we're not alone in this space. It's a growing and active space. There's a lot happening at the moment. Talking to my team recently, I sort of described ourselves. We're kind of the Super Mario Brothers of policy engagement. You know, we're running around. There's lots of plumbing. There's lots of piping. There's lots of activity. Lots of actors in this space. And what we're sort of trying to do is partly look at where some of the gaps are, but also looking at meeting that supply and demand, so that sort of flow and interest and opportunities can be all matched up. So just briefly on our public policy vision. Right. So yeah, realise the potential of social and economic research and expertise to inform and shape public policy at all levels, improving outcomes for citizen society and the economy. So very interrupter-driven, clear conviction that the economic and social sciences can make a big difference through informing public policy. So this is our, the logo not coming up, so this is our policy fellowship scheme that's running at the moment. 24 fellows, 11 different government departments, range of academic themes and government departments. I'm just going to whiz on to my last slide. Sorry, timing slightly off here. So just say a bit about the fellowships programme itself. So why are we doing this? And ultimately, it's about improving the exchange of knowledge between policy and academic institutions. So that's why we're supporting the fellowships programme. So for policymakers, it's about giving them access to insights and expertise. So it's connecting with the fellows, but also the fellows' respective academic communities. It's about increasing their ability to engage with the breadth of academic expertise in the UK, not just the usual suspects. For the academics, it's about supporting career development, about building new connections with your peers, so we're deliberately kind of connecting the fellows with one another, with policymakers. Again, about trying to kind of increasing the capacity and the capabilities around understanding how to effectively engage with policymakers, and increasing the range of opportunities to impact, generate impact from their research. And it's this phrase that we were just talking about in the last workshop's co-design. So really about providing the opportunities and the space for academic communities and policy organisations to work together to co-design and co-produce research that is both effective for increasing our knowledge, but also for driving evidence-based effective public policy. Sorry, I went slightly over.
Thank you very much. That was really, really useful. Right, so what we will do now is invite our... I think my title has disappeared. That's meant to say policy fellows. I'll invite all these lovely policy fellows and their supervisors, or if that's what we call them, up to the front. If you're happy to do so, I will remove this slide so that they can introduce themselves. A couple of people are online, I think. Do we know who's on? Paula's online, and
Sophie Wynne-Jones.
Okay, thank you, Sophie Wynne-Jones. Okay, I'll just stop sharing the slide so we can see everyone. Come. I know, they're reluctant. Okay, so we will try and... It's always really weird, awkward sitting in the front. In the beginning, it'll be wonderful. Right, what I'm going to do, I was going to introduce everybody, but I'm not going to do that because I don't think it works very well. So instead, I will, maybe you can all each just say 2 sentences, who you are, what your role is, maybe how long.
Sure. So hi all, Sam Jones. I work at Defra in the Net Zero Strategy team. I don't actually supervise any fellows, but I do work closely with Joe and Lily, who both also work at Defra. But Paula, who's virtual, and I'm sure she'll introduce herself in a minute, is the supervisor. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm Carol Williams. I work within the Welsh Government in a kind of policy terms, semi-embedded, so it's kind of not completely central evidence function, but semi-embedded within the Environment and Rural Affairs Directorate. I don't formally supervise, or I'm not the formal host for Sophie Wynne-Jones, who's joining us remotely. But again, I work very closely with Sophie. I'm not in a social science role specifically at the moment, but that's my background, and I've got quite a lot of experience of working with other fellows that we've got in place within Welsh Government at the moment, and I've worked with fellows in Defra in the past as well.
Hi, I'm Jo Hale. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University College London's Centre for Behaviour Change. So my background's in psychology, and I now work in behaviour change for sustainability. And I'm one of the ESRC policy fellows at Defra, working on behavioural science and net zero, and a 25-year plan as well.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Emma Claydon. I'm in BEIS's
social and behavioural energy research team. And within the team, I lead on net zero societal change. And we had Christina in our team, and we have another fellow, Jacqueline, who's joined us a few weeks ago too.
Hi, I'm Christina Dembski. I'm currently at Cardiff, but next week I'm starting a reader position in Bath. I was seconded to BEIS, but it wasn't part of the ESRC fellowship scheme. Emma's predecessor and myself kind of worked it out as part of my role in CAST, so the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. And I recently completed my secondment. I think I was officially Net Zero Public Engagement Advisor.
Hello everyone, my name is Lily Jia. I'm another ESRC policy fellowship with Defra, and I'm based with the strategic behavior insights team and also resources and waste team, and I'm also a senior research associate from University of Cambridge.
Excellent, thank you very much. And where are our online participants? Sophie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Sophie Wynne-Jones, and sorry, I've got a bit of background noise. I'm not sure if that's coming through for you guys. I'm currently an ESRC policy fellow working with the Welsh Government, so working with Carol and others there, and environment and rural affairs, and I'm looking particularly at behavioural insight on agriculture and supporting Welsh Government with the new farming schemes, agri-environment schemes, after departing from the EU.
Excellent, thank you very much. And Paula?
Hi, I'm Paul Lazzani. I'm joint head of the strategic behavioural insights team in Defra. So Joe and Lily are working with us on the fellowship.
Excellent, thank you very much. Right, we've got quite a nice group of people here, so we have some brains to pick. So I'll start maybe with asking, perhaps some of the fellows can say a little bit about what attracted them to doing this, and also maybe reflect on whether it was similar or different, in what way than expected. Christina, do you want to, since you got the microphone?
Yeah. I mean, as I said, it was a little bit different. Working?
Oh yeah.
What do I have to do?
Yeah.
Oh, like this. Okay. It's very specific. Okay. Yeah. So we were talking about sort of exchanges between our academic centre and the various policy teams within the Net Zero the social research team within BEIS, and we've had existing partnerships with them. And the idea of a secondment came up, and we sort of we tried to work out who had capacity to do it, and it turns out I had capacity to do it. And also I was liaising with Ben, Emma's predecessor, and I was very, very interested in the opportunity, so sort of took it upon myself. I think I was interested mostly because I wanted to learn more about the policy space in this area and how to facilitate, I guess, exactly what the fellowship's trying to do, facilitate social science expertise within policy making. And I think, in terms of my personal learning, I've gotten a lot out of it. I'll just leave it at that for now. Just give the others. In terms of actual impact, we'll see. But
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to say something. So I suppose I was interested in the fellowship scheme for a few reasons. I'd done some policy related secondments in the past as a PhD student and a postdoc, which I'd found really enjoyable and interesting. And I'd also had the opportunity to do some small pieces of consultancy work for Welsh Government and Defra and BEIS, and I really enjoyed the chance to work to a brief and know that you're doing research which is not just going to have impact, but it's kind of directly having that impact because somebody's really asked for that. And so, yeah, I was also found out about the ESRC fellowships and was interested in it because I'd worked with Paula before on a scheme that UCL runs called the Behavioural Insights Exchange, where students from social sciences can work with outside partners from industry or other sectors on projects that are co-supervised between someone from that organisation and a UCL supervisor. So there were a few different routes in, probably like other fellows, but that was how I got interested. And as for things that perhaps were surprising or unexpected, something that I'd hoped for, didn't necessarily expect, but seems to be coming about, is that actually on the fellowship, I get my role is a bit more defined, I would say, than my research role at UCL. And so I actually get to focus a lot more on the kind of thinking work and research work that I sometimes don't have time for in being a postdoc at UCL. So that's been really enjoyable so far.
Is that like because you're working on very specific topics, or?
Yeah, I think perhaps because the project's very well defined and my split of time is a bit clearer. So all of those other things which crowd into academic work, like your outreach, mentoring students, getting involved in networks, doing talks, responding to questions, all kinds of different things, it's a little bit more managed as to what the focus is going to be, because I'm on a slightly shorter term, 12-month program of research. And so it's actually been really nice to have that focus.
So you would recommend it to everyone?
Yeah, of course, for all sorts of reasons, but including that one. Yeah.
Excellent. Just making sure that we don't leave out the people online. Sophie, would you like to?
Yeah, great. So, I mean, I guess for me, a bit like Joe's just outlined there, I mean, I've had some past experience working with Welsh Government when I was doing postdoc work, and I enjoyed that. And so that, when I saw the fellowship opportunity, that made that quite attractive to me. I think more broadly, my research has always been very applied, so if I wasn't going to be trying to have policy impact, there'd be that question of why am I doing what am I doing anyway? And I think that at the moment, we've just left the EU, given the climate crisis, etc., the whole kind of policy area I'm working on is really exciting. We're just developing new schemes. It's like the perfect opportunity to get involved. So I thought, great, this is a really good moment to get involved and to see if I can sort of shape some of the thinking around that future policy direction and, kind of provide the evidence support needed there. And to learn more about how Welsh Government are using evidence, because I think, maybe like other academics can sort of sit back in my university space and think, why haven't they engaged with this, or why haven't they sort of taken this on board? And it's like, right, okay, well, let's get in there and find out more about this and how you're using evidence and how we can help work together more effectively. So that was why this was attractive to me.
That idea of using evidence and impact is really quite interesting, isn't it? So, yeah, I'll ask everybody's reflections on this, but yeah, Lily, go.
Yeah, I agree with the other fellows and regarding understanding that this is a good opportunity to understand the real world problem, understanding how policymakers think and see how the research can contribute to that. And just I would like to add on that, and also the previous, so the current fellowship, I found that my previous research experience and also could be also beneficial to the host. And so my current policy research focuses on consumption behavior. And but at the same time, we also find that following the discussions. And so I also learned that different teams are therefore also interested in the sustainable behaviors from the production side. And also Paula helped me a lot about promoting the webinars. So next month we're going to have 2 webinars, mainly talking about the previous research project about how we can use a different approach to motivate the sustainable production.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. So maybe we can hear from one of the supervisors. No, not everybody here is a supervisor. Ex-supervisor, new supervisor. What your perspectives are on the benefits? Just move the microphone down this way. The value and the benefit for organisation like BEIS of having these fellowships.
Yeah, so I think it's been really, really valuable, which is why we've gone for a second fellow this time around. And I think it's just getting different perspectives into government. We can, be a bit insular sometimes, which we're trying to change, but having that opportunity to get a doorway into the academic world, even if to start with it's like a little door, and then we can use that to build more bridges and connections. And I think more practically, it's really useful to kind of help us identify areas of priority and for our future research, and see what's already going on out there that we're not aware of in the academic world. To inform where we want to go next as well. So yeah, but so many more benefits as well. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll echo what Emma said. I think particularly in the net zero space in Defra, there are so many evidence gaps around social science, behaviour change, and having a research fellow that can work on that on such an impactful area and help influence policy and really leave a legacy in the departments. I think that's extremely valuable, and we can kind of see those tangible results, or hopefully will, in the next few years. But yeah, really echo what the others have been saying.
Have there been a policy? Yeah. I'm just wondering.
Just to add one kind of quick thing. So I would echo all of those things. But the other, in terms of what makes a fellow unique, I think there are lots of things. But one thing, when I asked Sophie's host and colleagues in Welsh Gov about this, one of the things that was flagged is that it's a safe space, so that you've got somebody who's kind of inside of government. So you can have those conversations where you don't really know what you want, and you can be more honest. You can bring people in to work on things that are maybe sensitive, and government is always oversensitive about stuff, but something where you wouldn't openly commission research, but you're happy to kind of work with a fellow to explore things initially before commissioning and that kind of thing.
Okay, that's really interesting. So opening up lots of opportunities as well that you wouldn't normally be able to, explore. That's really interesting. Yeah. Paula, do you want to add something?
Just to echo what everybody else has said, and also to bring in what Jo was mentioning from her side, that she has the opportunity to focus on something a bit more than she might have been in her academic role. I think the flip side to us is that it's great to have somebody who actually has the opportunity to focus on a theme or topic, more so than maybe one of our internal researchers might be able to, because of all those other demands on our time. So really doing that focused thinking and getting a bit deeper on something that can be quite complex.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. And one thing I was thinking is in relation to the discussion we had this morning about co-production, whether you, from your perspectives, where you feel that this builds opportunities for future co-production because you're building new links, and maybe also what potentially the challenges might be with keeping this going to build on these relationships. So I don't know if Christina?
I was going to say one of the things that I probably got out of it was, for me, becoming a little bit more senior in academia. There's expectations that I engage with policy, but it can also be quite daunting, and you're building the networks, and you're often asked to be an expert on things where you don't 100% feel. I think we can be very specific in our expertise sometimes, but actually when you talk to policymakers, all of a sudden they're asking you, what's the evidence on this? What's the evidence on this? And it's within the broad remit of what you're doing, at least for me, but it's still, I don't know the latest research on this. So I think in that sense it's given me some more confidence, but also kind of starting to build the networks through which we can continue having those kinds of conversations. And this problem that we identified earlier today, that asking for sort of letters of support from policymakers, like in the last minute. It's not really the last minute. It's just the minute happens within the process. That's really short in the application cycle. But at least you're building on something where there's had been original discussions around these topics, so they don't kind of come out of the blue, and you've already doing that co-production before there's an official grant, for example. But one of the things I just wrote down was that I think one of the things that I feel like are going to limit me doing co-productive research in the future is this idea that government is really sensitive about things, and there are lots of things that all of a sudden maybe they're no longer wishing to have that conversation with me because it's considered sensitive. And I think that really, really limits co-production, because we understand that there are constraints on what they can share with us, but if we don't know what those constraints are, it's really difficult to work within that space. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's something, because that's something you don't really know when you're working as a researcher, I guess, that you can't have necessarily an open conversation to solve a problem because some information might be sensitive.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I mean, I guess maybe the hosts are better able to talk about this, but, there are moments in time where all of a sudden things become more tenable, or some things are just shut down, and I guess maybe they're allowed to communicate about some of those things, but we don't necessarily know why policymakers are interested in certain things at a certain moment in time. But in terms of more strategic long-term co-production, I think it's still possible. But I think sometimes, some of the things I worked on, there's still questions about whether I can now continue having those conversations with the same team members, because I'm no longer under contract with them. So I don't have that code of conduct anymore. I mean, I'm not about to run to the Daily Mail and talk about anything, but I guess it's a risk they take with some researchers. I don't know. But, you'd think it's not that controversial, but there's lots of things that are a little bit controversial, and politically, certainly in some areas, are more difficult to talk about than others.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Beth, it's...
Sorry.
Thanks. This is really. We have had some ESRC fellows in Natural England, but I haven't had much experience myself working with them. And I'm wondering what, especially my colleagues in agencies and government departments, think in terms of the breadth of disciplines that we bring in. It's quite. I know obviously ESRC's got behavioural science focus, and it's often a lot more sort of translatable, isn't it, into policy, the behavioural sciences. But I'm wondering, has anyone got a sense of anthropologists, for example, critical theorists, sort of the breadth of the social sciences, are they represented in these policy fellows, and what might be some of the barriers to sort of getting some of those disciplines into our thinking?
Yeah, you can have mine. That'll be easier.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Okay. So I sat on the panel for this ESRC call, and actually seeing some of the applications that were coming in, they were quite broad. It wasn't just focused on more of the kind of behavioural science stuff. Based on experience in Defra in the past, I've worked with quite a few fellows coming from much more, my background's in anthropology, but more on the kind of cultural geography side of things. And I think they've had a real impact, like both directly, but also in terms of that kind of longer term diffuse way of changing the way that people value evidence and changing the way that people value perspectives. I think the challenge is often helping them to communicate that effectively to policymakers who are busy, and also ensuring that calls and things are written in a way that enable us to get those kind of perspectives in. But I think it has been done effectively, and I think with a lot of impact. So I think it's definitely can be done. We also in Welsh Government have a lot of non-social science fellows as well, doing things like systems and stuff. So.
Sorry.
Could I just add? I mean, my fellowship, the framing was around agricultural behavioural insight. I read that initially and thought, oh, that's not for me. I'm a human geographer, not a psychologist, and thought, maybe that doesn't fit my brief. But actually, Carol and others have been very welcoming of the perspective that I have, appreciating that the way I think about behaviour change is perhaps more in terms of sort of social change. And I actually think within government, and having had conversations with colleagues in Defra as well, I know the same is true there, that it isn't about individual behaviour change in a fairly narrow perspective. The way the kind of the models of thinking do encompass anthropology, geography, sociology, and so on and so forth. So I think, maybe just being a little bit aware of how things are advertised, because we as academics might sort of see things and think, oh, is that for me? I think there's maybe more of a barrier from the perspective of us as academics assuming what it is that policymakers and government teams want. Whereas actually, my experience has been that you're much more open-minded than I might have otherwise have assumed. So I think perhaps the way it's framed to us would be helpful.
Yeah, excellent. I've got another question. Does anyone have a reflection first? And then I'll go. I'm going to run around now. This will be my exercise.
Yeah. I think I just want to also link to yesterday when we talked about interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, and so there are challenges in terms of integrating different disciplines together. But in the policy scenario, so when we think about working with policymakers, the challenge is actually when we look at the real world, and there isn't any boundary about discipline. But your research needs to have a discipline, needs to have a boundary, even it's multidisciplinary. And identifying that boundary, and it takes time, and also how to clarify in a way that can be more integrated and develop more coherent research. I think that's also kind of a common challenge for many of our fellows. And so last month we had a cohort discussion, and so different fellows from different departments, we all share these challenges because it's just the problem just too complex, and how to identify a real research question that can be solved in a very short period.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just kind of had a question about sort of how the fellowships are structured, because Royal Holloway's campus has quite a lot of natural land around it, a lot of which is landscaped, and also a lot of it is essentially living laboratory. So, for instance, we're developing a beaver habitat, we have an arboretum, we have community garden spaces, and we have an estates team who manage that. Now, fellowship could essentially be with the estates team rather than actually with the academic departments. And we actually work very closely with our estates team, and students will do projects that the estate team want to gather evidence for. But that is also part of kind of decarbonising agendas, and we also work with kind of decarbonising the NHS. But are there opportunities for those fellowships to be almost kind of with estates teams of universities rather than with the academic departments? And would that actually advantage the organisations, or kind of how, and that's kind of just sort of throwing out there was a blue sky idea as to would that work, would it be attractive to either side, and then how might that actually work in practice?
I can just say a quick thing. I think it might be a question also for ESRC and how they view these fellowships. I was just going to add, from my perspective, we've got some PhDs who are co-funded by, for example, one of them is a National Park Authority, I think. It sounds a little bit similar to if you were placed in an estate service looking for specific questions to be answered. And I think they can work really well, but there are specific challenges there that might be, working out what the organisation wants to happen, and whether it's research related or impact related, and how that fits with a particular, whether it's a PhD or a research associate or a researcher. I mean, I think some of the challenges are similar, but in an organisation where specific things have to happen, there exist new challenges to add to the existing challenges we have to in terms of policy, I think.
I guess a kind of question. Could our estates manager essentially be the co-eye on the bid? Is that acceptable under the...
I think that's something I want. Sorry, I don't know. We can ask but I think it's more a question for our ESRC colleague whether that's.
But organisations can be partners on research projects as well.
So yeah.
We all do that all the time. Yeah, and there can be.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll summarise. Can organisations be part of BID? Yes, they all have been quite a lot already. So yes, they can. That is possible to not just have a university and a policy organisation, but other organisations can be part of this as well.
They're not necessarily
but
an organisation; they are Royal Holloway employees.
Yeah. I'm sure. Yeah, let's take that conversation on with the ESRC.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up on Christina's point about when things become politically difficult in a UK government context. sometimes for precisely those reasons that they may become easier to discuss in other devolved administration governments, Scotland, for example. And I noticed there aren't any Scottish policy fellows, and that might be something we want to explore, how we can set that up so that we have a set of policy fellows that work across all of the devolved administrations.
Absolutely. Are there none at all, the Scottish policy fellows? But they're not here, but it's too far. It's a different country. But yeah, you're absolutely right. They definitely need to expand. Okay.
Just very quick. Very quick. I mean, just because something isn't in vogue at a moment, that doesn't mean that you can't necessarily work with a particular group of people on specific policy ideas and so on. But I think the relationship changes, and I think that's really important to kind of figure out, because I've exactly had that experience. I am also working with Scottish Government on their public engagement strategy around heat in buildings, and it's very different. But I think the challenge is there for us academics to work out how best to have an impact in the different political contexts, but also in the different ways of working that they produce policy. And I think I've done lots of learning over the last few years in how to do that, I think.
Just to come in specifically on the point about when things get difficult, and it was highlighted, so I think we had a list of questions in advance that I put to Sophie's actual host around challenges, and it's like, well, what do we do afterwards? So we've got a load of fellows, they're brilliant, it's amazing, everybody thinks they're great, but they're going to go, and what are we going to do afterwards? But also picking up on the point about it's I think I can say this. I'm not sure if Welsh Government still has a contract for Sophie's fellowship, because our HR and procurement people have made it so difficult. I think it's because of the ESRC conditions and stuff. I think there is a contract in place now, but it's been painful and it's taken ages. So obviously, as soon as that ends, there's it's risky. We can't have these open conversations. Kind of slant on things. So I do wonder whether there's something practical there for the ESRC to think about. At the moment, there's, I think, a kind of an end bit with kind of fewer days for impact and knowledge exchange and dissemination of the fellowship work. But maybe that should be a much longer term thing to try and maintain those relationships where the kind of conditions of contract can be extended. It's just something to think about.
And just to add on that, I think data is quite a difficult thing because it's very a lot of it can be quite sensitive, particularly around net zero and 25-year environment plan. So it's great that we can share data with Joe and Lily whilst they work with us and are under Defra contracts. But once that finishes, it's probably going to be quite difficult to continue that data sharing relationship.
Yeah, I just wondered if I could quickly maybe unpack a few of the things that we've been talking about from a slightly more logistical point of view of how the fellowships work. And obviously I can mainly only speak to my own fellowship, but I think some of this applies. So Jenny asked about the structure, and I think one of the things that's been really positive about the structure of the fellowship scheme is that there's for most people, there's a scoping period before the main research period, which is part of your funded time on the fellowship. And at least the way that it's worked for me is that, I applied to a particular kind of outline of what the fellowship might look like and its main deliverables put together by Defra. And then we've had this detailed period of kind of scoping out together with a bit of a steering group within Defra, exactly what the project should involve. And from my point of view, that's been really positive in kind of co-framing the questions, figuring out exactly what should be delivered. And then at the end of the research phase as well, there's also a funded period for knowledge transfer. And right from the beginning of applying for the fellowships, we were encouraged and asked to put in our applications, what would you do as part of the kind of knowledge transfer activities. It's been something that we've built into kind of my timeline and plan for what I'm going to be doing on the fellowship. And so from my point of view, those are less typical, perhaps, parts of a normal process, but it seems to be really good that they've been kind of built in, and that's definitely helped. And so although there are all these kind of logistical difficulties around the sensitivity of information, at least it's something that we're having conversations about right throughout and from the start, which I think has been quite positive. So I don't know if that helps people get a bit more inside view on it.
Waiting for ages.
Thank you. Ruth Garside from Exeter University. I think it picks up a little bit on what you were saying about longevity and what happens beyond the fellowship, and also some things you said, Christina, about, you know, once you've got that relationship and then people are coming to you because that relationship's there, but not necessarily for topics that are your area of expertise. And I'm just thinking about what the role of the access network might be to try and kind of maximise these nodes of connection, so that you would not necessarily know, but know how to find out somebody who was an expert in that method or in that topic area or in that arena, and how we can do that both while you're in the fellowship but also beyond it. So strategies for how we store that information and how we find it. And also just thinking about, I do a lot of systematic reviews, so one of the most useful people we have in our team are information scientists who know how to search databases and identify particular pieces of research about specific topics, and just like having a structure for how we find out either about specific bits of evidence or expert advice, an expert network of people who might then be able to feed in.
That would help us, the social scientists in government and agencies as well. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really useful. Any policy fellows can make that.
Yeah, I think I just want to comment, because yesterday we discussed about building the database. I was just wondering, because currently in environmental research or in social science, we didn't have that database. But if you look at the biology, and they have, for example, for the protein, they have a UniProt. So that's kind of an ontology type of research, so structured by the classification of this specific problem, and you can find all the knowledge related to that. You can search on that. We don't have it in the social science, but I think what you two just mentioned is just thinking probably some database like that for environmental research. And and also many of us yesterday and today has discussed, we regardless of which discipline we're coming from, and we share the common questions. And so the database will be framed around the questions, and for each question and from each perspective, the clusters can be structured, and from different perspectives, what kind of cutting edge research and answer we have, and it can directly link to the specific research. You can also easily find the expert in that regarding field. So I think that is the kind of the ontology type of database.
Yeah, can I just add? I think part of it was also that my fellowship wasn't a fellowship. My secondment wasn't as structured as the ones that are now, and I think, to some extent I wanted to help whichever way I could. Yeah. But ultimately, I think access is, at least how I think access might function, and with some of the rapid response or task forces and so on, I think can fill some of those holes where sometimes I felt like it would be good for me to quickly ask some experts in the field to just make sure that the advice I'm giving on a specific topic is actually correct or the latest, or there might be other perspectives as well, so it doesn't fall on a particular individual that's embedded in an organization, but that there's a practical way to gather information and help. But the thing is, it only will work with some things, because again, we're asking people again to do things for free. It adds to the the thing about the academics do on the side as well. I mean, everyone wants to have impact, but it is a time-consuming task. So I think we've also talked about, I think with Patrick and so on, about databases and so on being difficult to maintain and so on. But I think there is a role for access to perhaps facilitate some of that in a more systematic way, rather than just, oh, I know someone who does social science, let's ask them. So yeah.
Very quick, desperately lovely.
So do you think then there's a role for access to sort of maybe help early career research or anyone thinking about these to be in that space of answering responsively? Because as a social science, I still get flustered and panicky about having to do that myself, but so maybe that could be something Access could help with. How do you respond when you're asked something that's out of your field, as well as I really like Lily's database idea, because often the trouble with what we see out there, what you produce out there, is what you've done, not what you're doing at the moment. So something that's very current would be very helpful, but again, maintaining it is an issue, I know.
I think that's it. Yeah, sorry. Go.
Shall I jump in? So I think the idea of database is something that I've really been keen to have for a long time, so I could have really access to academics to ask these very simple, quick questions, not rather than something more detailed where we would go through a commissioning route. Anyway, but what struck me when I was listening to the panel is that pretty much everybody who is a fellow at the moment is here partly because they've had previous contact with government in one way or another. So making those links. So I think kind of just bringing policymakers and other people in government together with academics in a fairly informal way might be the great first step for Access, because then that facilitates those very initial contacts, conversations that then spark further interest and these maybe more formal routes into government.
Yeah, I think. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think definitely this is one thing that we really want to achieve within Access, to bring the policy fellows and everybody else together to provide that place, that space where people can contact each other. How exactly we're going to do that? Searchable database is, of course, one step, but it's maybe not enough to actually build the links to foster co-production, but it has to be part of it, I guess. So that's definitely something that we are exploring, developing. I noticed that, Patrick, you put a few notes. Did you want to say something? Is your throat really... No?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, sorry to intrude in a way, but I think people are raising really interesting points that I think are right on the button of what Access is going to try and do. In a way, they're raising things that have come up already in terms of the need to know what people are currently doing. Websites are always out of date by the time they're kind of produced. There's never enough resource into keeping them up to speed. So we've already had a request that whatever Access website we end up with, there is a section on it where you can pretty easily see who is out there and what their expertise in. So if people wish to find out a topic expert or a methods expert or whatever it is, they can relatively easily access that. So we are going to try and do that. And I just think the other point that's been made is to connect up the secondments with, say, the agile response. If secondments put individuals into policy context, say, but the rapid response is more about bringing teams of experts to bear. And I think previously we had really seen those as completely separate parts of our work program, but now we're coming up that actually it might be quite productive sometimes to connect them up maybe. And if an individual in a secondment context needs some additional support or expertise, who do they ring, who do they call? So maybe that's another way in which our kind of agile response that Karen Bickerstaff is leading on could kind of have a way into co-production and policy making. And I think the point Paula made about people having previous experience, I noted that too. I think that almost everybody we've heard in a policy secondment context has had some kind of previous interest or expertise, and that makes me think back to what we're doing in WP2 and whether we can make those initial experiences and spaces for interaction between sectors part of our training that we're providing and empowerment that we're trying, and then maybe secondments can come following that because people have that experience to draw on. So lots of really great ideas that I hope we can take on board over the next couple of years.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. Nigel had a question.
Yes, thank you. I'm Nigel Gilbert from the University of Surrey. I see policy fellows as kind of boundary spanners. You're sort of you're sitting in the middle, if you like, between policy making and academia. And then we started talking, just touched on, what happens next. And I think that's a really interesting question, because you could go into policy making full time, or you could go into academia full time. And I'm wondering how you're going to manage that. It has practical consequences because while you're a policy fellow, I suspect you're going to be on a kind of policy-making timetable, as it were, that is going to make writing academic papers that you will need to follow an academic career relatively difficult. But maybe some of you might be intending to use these policy fellowships as a stepping stone to a career in the civil service. So it may be fine, but I'm just interested in how you're going to manage that tension, especially about where you're thinking of going next.
Thanks, Nigel. I think that's a great question, and I think it was put to us in the application process, slightly to elaborate on how we might use these fellowships as stepping stones. For me in particular, I'm sort of at the transition from early career more into mid-career. And I would definitely see it as a stepping stone for working more in a kind of, to be honest, research for policy interface type of space. And I think the way you framed your question was around you could go into a traditional academic career route or into a policy route. I mean, I would most like to forge ahead in a sort of hybrid route, something that is more like continuing the type of model that this fellowship is. And if that path doesn't exist, then, forging a way through the bracket and kind of muddling through somehow in future, because, I would see this as a bit of a way to test the waters and kind of understand how we can get through all those barriers that seem to exist, which, are kind of logistical things that can be overcome. And I think ESRC are working really, really hard behind the scenes to kind of do all of that, as I understand. And it's things like having the right sorts of contracts in place, having the right sorts of assurances about the sensitivity of information. And for sure, in my view, I think a big concern that's shared amongst quite a lot of the fellows is how much we can share and publish knowledge that is produced using government information which can't necessarily be easily shared. I mean, one way that I would be looking to not have that as a pitfall on my fellowship project is that perhaps the new methods and approaches which I will be bringing to the work are the things which would actually be of most value and interest to the academic community, and that might not necessarily need to involve sharing the exact details of the sensitive information, for example. But yeah, I don't think that it needs to necessarily be an either or. I'm really hoping that this is a sign of, the sort of new things to come in research. I was going to say in academia, but, perhaps we should just stop using that label quite so much and say in research in future. And I'm hoping I won't have to make the dichotomous choice.
I was just going to add, because I've just finished, and I never had the intention of really not staying in academia, partly maybe because I was already in a sort of mid-level career and I had a permanent contract. But, I think that, I think there is a lot of people, particularly in this social science, environmental space, that would like to do exactly what you've described. And I work with people who are currently on secondments, not ESRC secondments, but similar, who are doing exactly that to kind of test the waters to see, and ideally they come back to a place where they would try and do both. And I'm the same. So my secondment was only ever at the most 50%, and it was really hard having two jobs. I mean, I would not, recommend that to anyone, but it was also really, really great because I did do the research at the same time as, doing some of the policy work. And ideally, I would do something like this, but it's not really possible at the moment. And I think, once things like, permanent contracts and so on become important, you do have to still choose. And I'm, at the moment, I'm not sure whether there is a path forward, but who knows? Maybe there's more imaginative people out there than me. But I think the key thing is that I will now hopefully be doing research. I mean, I was already doing policy relevant research, but the idea is that I'd be working closer with policy and that I feel more confident and have the capacity or capabilities to do proper co-production research rather than just sort of talk about it in my applications, but actually change the way that I do research to some extent, while also still being an academic and challenging the system.
Just to add very kind of briefly on that from the host's perspective, I think I've seen fellows who've become civil servants. I've seen fellows who've become civil servants and then academics and then back in again and in and out. But also fellows who've gone into a really strong academic career. And I think there is, on the part of the host, the need to be a bit flexible. So the kind of the bedding in time for a fellow is a bit about that negotiation of what's useful, what does the fellow really want to get out of it. They should have time to write academic papers as part of the fellowship if that's something that's really important. So I think there's a need for a kind of negotiation, I think, and it really is individual. And you know, a fellow might be spec'd in a certain way, picking up on Beth's point about maybe not that much thought has gone into it. So I guess it's worth applying and then having that conversation, really, depending on what you want to get out of it.
Can I just, one potential suggestion, I don't know if this works, but University of Exeter has a number of academics, professors who are both at the Met Office and at the university. So there are models that exist that we could kind of look at. I think those hybrid roles are really important, and I think you guys have already got this expertise. It would be really good if we can get this pathway a longer term thing. It addresses a lot of the things that we were talking about in the breakout groups, right? About what happens when these things end. And, you know, the actual process of applying for them is so time intensive, and the time that you're there is actually very short. So, you know, there is a kind of economies of scale thing going on here.
I was just wondering if there's a role for access herein. Would it be useful to, because I was in a breakout room with a lot of academics that had really strong, deep policy-based careers, but there's sort of examples or case studies of and what people's, and I can think of, like, we work a lot with CCRI, for example, at the University of Gloucestershire, and they forge their sort of expertise around being really policy relevant, and so there are some really good examples there that maybe could be sort of held up. And I think partly it's about where you're sitting, isn't it, which research group and how policy focused they are, but is that something for Access to think about?
Yeah, there's definitely lots of great examples here already, and using that to build stories and to share them with the rest of the world. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's really interesting that there are already joint professorships like this, so that would be really interesting to look into. I do think it's important that the fellowship scheme doesn't become a particular route, so should be people who want to stay in academia, but also maybe people who want to explore something else or a joint model, so that we don't just self-select people into a fellowship scheme that want to have a joint career if it's possible, but also people can stay in academia. So, and my experience has been actually hosts, organisations have been much better with providing time to reflect on those things. Academic life is way, way, way too busy for that.
I guess my personal experience is very similar to what's been outlined already, in so much that I have a permanent academic contract, and my thinking is I will go back to that. I wasn't envisaging a major change from that, but I think what I would like to do is to have a better relationship with government afterwards, but they're sort of how to communicate better. And I think one of the things we're really raising in the conversation today is where the barriers to that might be occurring. I think there are issues around sensitivity and confidentiality and so on and so forth. So maybe it is quite potentially important for Access to kind of think, well, what could be the ongoing barriers? Once we've been through these fellowships, we are more embedded. We know the people within the teams. We've got people's emails addressed. We've kind of we've made friends. We've got a sense of the policy landscape, etc., etc. But what are the barriers that are then kind of stopping us from moving forwards and having kind of this productive, co-productive kind of relationship going forwards? And I think it is interesting that some universities, Beth mentioned CCRI, there are people there who do work kind of spanning this space, kind of very, very effectively. I mean, one of the things I'm aware of, and Matt Lobley brought this up this morning, a lot of the time the types of work that government is asking for is contract research. There's very short timescales around that. A lot of the time in a traditional academic role, I just don't have the capacity to do that work. I could do that when I was a postdoc in a position where I specifically was geared towards doing government work, but normally in my usual lecturing role, there's no way I can even begin to consider engaging with, kind of Welsh Government or Defra research, which in some ways is that then means I'm just kind of excluded from that conversation. So maybe thinking about some of these kind of practicalities about, well, what sort of research is it that government is commissioning? How is government having conversations with academics? Because potentially, because of my career path that I had taken as a lecturer, I wasn't engaging in the sort of research that was enabling me to have these regular conversations with government, even though I was actually doing research that was very, very relevant to the types of questions they're interested in. So maybe setting out a clearer sense of what these barriers are, beyond the sensitivity issues that we've raised, could be helpful.
Turnover by government. You make relationships.
Don't know what happened there. Is that me? Ooh. A better turnover in government makes it difficult. I was wondering, but do feel free, but just a general question as well, whether people feel that it's sort of changing, whether it's getting better. I think I heard a little bit about this from you earlier around this already, because of REF and because of impact and because of the increased pressure on us to have impact, these kinds of things, we wouldn't even have this kind of panel discussion 5 years ago, probably. So are there increasing roles? I don't know, maybe you can share your perspective and then I shall hand this microphone over to someone else.
I'm not sure if I can answer the question directly. My limited perspective is that everyone seems to be really in support of these kinds of things. Everyone thinks it's a great idea. But I know that it's caused big headaches for people who have to help from the professional services side at the universities. So, poor people are trying to get their heads around brand new types of agreements, types of grants that don't follow the usual structure, weird timings where you're splitting, you're doing a scoping period and then a research period and then a knowledge transfer period all on the same project. And so, I'm just thinking that it must be really important to have those people that are handling the kind of complex business and agreement side of it involved in the conversations throughout, so that we're not just saying, we'd love to do this, and then saying, please help us do this without any real context. So
if I kind of mirror that from the government side, is equally, I think the government bodies are trying to get to grips with what types of people are the fellows, and are they secondees? Is there a different kind of a contract and so forth? So these practicalities should not be dismissed, and they can really put barriers. I'd say, beyond that, I had a thought. Could you remind me what the question was that we were discussing?
Are things changing? Impact is becoming more important.
Yeah, so I feel like it is to an extent changing. So we do have a wider range of organizations, academics that we do contact, but it's still a little bit, I don't feel like we've got quite the range that I would like. And we do have this trusted list of people that we go to because they are known to us, they are familiar faces, we know they are good already. And poor people, they're getting so many peer review requests from us and things like that. So it would just be good to really widen that. But I feel like there is a shift happening. I can't speak for all the departments, but I'd say Defra certainly there is more. And not that there was no effort before, but I think it's growing slowly.
I'm hogging the microphone, but I was just going to add, just in the professional service staff, I was going to add that my secondment only happened because we circumvented our central teams. And my head of department underwrote it so they didn't have to pay overheads, because government don't pay overheads. So in that sense, it's a huge issue, and it's a challenge both to the host organisations but also the university sector to come up with ways of dealing with these kinds of things. And within our centre we have PhD students who are on 3 months placements to do some data analysis for projects that we've got with Welsh Government, for example, and we have no way of paying them. It is ridiculous the challenges that exist around this, and I think it's a huge capacity issue and just know-how on how to deal with these kinds of contracts. And then just to add to also, I think the discussion around impact, I just wanted to add, the fellowships are one new way of trying to think about impact, social science impact, I guess. But that, in terms of access, we need to think about other way, how they connect with other ways. And one of the things that I've been thinking about also, that we've been sitting here and they've sort of come up, databases, expert panels, fellowships, all of these things, how they connect up isn't that clear to me yet, and maybe that's just me. But, to some extent, a lot, particularly in the past, I get the feeling secondments have always been relatively early career researchers, sometimes PhDs, particularly in BEIS, I think, and Defra. Whereas now, maybe with the fellowships, they're changing slightly, but they're still early career researchers, where it's the professors that sit on the expert panels, and maybe that's the right way to do it. But it's interesting to see what that means, and we need to access policy in different ways, but how exactly we do that, I think we're kind of forging the way forward, and I think Access is really uniquely placed to reflect on that and to try and, I guess, improve on it.
I just had two very brief comments. One was just a sort of shout out for ESRC Impact Acceleration Account. I think those sorts of streams are really useful for promoting impact, because they're awarded institutionally. You can apply as an internal applicant. It's much easier to get the money and it's much easier to apply. And I think those sorts of funds are really, really important for making impactful research happen. But I think probably, I'm not sure how widely distributed they are across different universities, but maybe more universities need to be able to access those funds. And also the second thing briefly was that I think impact is driving interdisciplinary working, because so the disciplines that are perhaps less naturally applied, like maybe political theory or maths, or but are having to engage with other more applied fields, and that's sort of really helping build links between disciplines, I think.
Just while we were exploring different models, it's maybe worth mentioning in Scotland we have the Climate Exchange, which has been set up to run across universities in Scotland to answer policy-relevant research questions, sampling. So it's problem-focused and then brings in the expertise that's required to address those issues. And there's a biodiversity centre being set up for this year, I think. So there are other ways of doing it as well. It might be worth just exploring different models of servicing those policy evidence needs.
Hi, Saffron O'Neill again, Exeter Access Co-Director Communication and Outreach. So there's a question come up on the chat that I wanted to answer from Paula, I think, although I'm sorry if I can't read very well because the lights in here make the screen quite difficult to read, about the summer school. So I wanted to say, question was, summer school sounds great, but it's only for academics. That there are two different things that Access is going to do. So the summer school is for PhD students, and 2 years before finishing, 2 years after, is that right? The first one. But it might change. Okay, but anyway, the summer school is PhD student focused, so it's early career academics. However, and that will be different people every time. It will be advertised each year that Access runs. There will also be a second cohort of future leaders, young leaders, early mid-career leaders, whatever. People who are doing cool stuff across academia and policy. And that will be called the Transdisciplinary Leaders College. And that will happen for years 2, 3, 4 and 5. So as in, there'll be a cohort of people who go across the 4 remaining years of Access. And that will be aimed at building networks between policy and academics. So yeah, there is a scheme, and we're really looking forward to people applying to that. And there'll be more news about that in due course. So look out for it in the autumn time.
Neil Ancher, University of Exeter. I was going to ask the people in government, although you may or may not feel you're able to say too much, but to answer or to directly address Brigitte's question about are things changing, are they positive, particularly these fellowships. I mean, presumably fellowships and other ways of garnering expert knowledge from outside of government within it. I mean, are they in some senses substitutes for doing some of this work in-house? And I don't know much about government, but at least observing national government UK national government. It's only speaking about that over the last decade, perhaps the in-house expertise has been somewhat eroded with through the Government Office of Science and various others. And of course then also, I guess, academics do become slightly wary of working too closely with government because it seems quite cyclical in terms of how evidence is used or not used. And, maybe COVID is a good example of science coming to the fore and expertise coming straight into government and positive, but there are as many negative examples as well. So you may not be able to say too much or feel it, but it seems from an outside that this seems we're all getting very excited about fellowships, but is it a sticking plaster on a bigger problem about the use of science and rational policy making? Thanks.
Said like a true social scientist, Neil.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer from a Welsh Government perspective. I think, yes, to an extent, you're completely right. So when you ask people, do you want, we also have a 3-month studentship placement, who wants a student or a fellow? Everybody does. Everybody's got loads of stuff they need to get done, and it's additional resource. So I think that is the initial reaction, but then there is a kind of process to work through when you realise, well, you can't, it's where how it's specified ESRC's role. It's not just additional resource. And I guess linking that to the second part of your question, I actually think I don't think it is something that it helps. It's not because of the erosion of the importance of science at the moment. It's just because of a lack of people to do stuff, if I'm honest. But I think that in terms of increasing the importance of evidence and science and increasing people's ability to use it and to know when they need it, then fellowships are really, really valuable. I think it would be really good if all of the fellows had a kind of capability building element built into what they're doing. So they might do a research project, but a core part of what they do is help to build kind of more intelligent customers for their work within government, help to emphasise the importance of it, and do come with a network of people that they can go to maintain those kind of relationships over time. So I don't think it is kind of a sticking plaster, a short-term thing that might go away as people kind of as the role of evidence in policy maybe becomes devalued over time or less valued. I think it's something that probably will continue to grow.
I just expand on what Carol's saying there. From my perspective as the fellow, I suppose I've been struck. I mean, it's a naivety on my part. It's kind of going in and thinking, oh right, it's like this, is it? I've been struck that a lot of the conversations I'm having with policy teams are about this kind of designing the questions with them. I think I could have kind of naively gone in assuming that they had a clear set of questions that they wanted me to be dealing with. But I think a lot of the time it has, Carol's phrase there, helping develop intelligent customers, as it were. I think policy teams, they've got a sense of what it is that they're interested in, but they're not quite sure how to ask those questions in terms of an evidence need. What is it that I actually need? And, what's kind of best kind of scientific practice in terms of addressing those evidence needs. I think that's important too. So, we can maybe say, how is science, how is social science, kind of thought of within government. But I think we actually need to get down to the nitty-gritty of actually really understanding how the different teams, what sort of capacity they have. So it's maybe not as simple as just saying, is science respected or is it not? It's like literally, kind of how is it comprehended? What sort of skill sets have we got within government? And I do see an important part of the role that I've been playing is, kind of supporting capacity within teams, not just doing kind of analytical work, but just actually building a wider set of skills, enhancing staff as research users, if that makes sense.
I see 2 more questions, and then I think no.
Said a lot, so someone else wants to.
Dave, you can say more. Okay. It's fine. It's allowed.
Sorry, I get very excited about this kind of thing. I think I agree with everything that's just been said, and I think yes, there are resource issues, certainly, but I mean, it's also, as I said before, we've just over-tripled our team, and so I think it's about academia helping us to make the most of that partly, and I think that someone said that the fellows don't just come themselves, they come with a network of people, and I think for us it's about you helping us to expand the role of social science within our organisations as well, because we as specialists in our organisations have a limited, skills and experiences. And then, for example, Paula's team does some amazing work on sort of training our colleagues to sort of, like someone said, Sophie said, make use of that evidence. And so there's also that sort of training role and upskilling role. I hate the term, but sometimes it's called intelligent customers for our for what we produce. And there's a really interesting paper by someone called Katerzi who worked in DEC. He was a social scientist who did his PhD in DEC, and he looked at what his work enabled the social science function to become within the department, and the number of different roles then could social science was sort of used for. And I think that's the kind of thing that sometimes these fellowships can do as well. Sort of move us into a different space. And as I mentioned before, we're doing a piece of work in Natural England at the moment to understand what does it mean to become evidence-led. And we are never going to get away from the fact that there will always be political, economic, resource-based, legal reasons why certain decisions are made. But I think what we perceive it as is we provide the evidence-based options that then can be our colleagues have a wide range of the best evidence to choose from in terms of what may be ministerial steer or whatever it is. So it's never going to be... I do read quite a lot of papers sort of saying, why do they not use the evidence? There's a lot of evidence out there. Like someone said, it's really complicated why some things evidence gets used and why some doesn't. And I think, that's what these fellows can help us to sort of show in government, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's one interesting thing is about assumptions, and so that's, I think it's not just about fellowship projects. It's also related to any applied projects and for policy development as well. So when we talk about, because it is interdisciplinary in nature, and it's very common that different stakeholders bring some hidden assumptions, and so that's the kind of how to identify these hidden assumptions and to set up a kind of assumptions across stakeholder and share that knowledge. So this process itself, I mean, for the fellowship, we experience this journey, and for the other projects, maybe also they may have this journey, and probably this is some knowledge and can be accumulated and communicated in the future through access.
Thanks. Yeah, Ruth Garside, I just wanted to follow up on a point that Sophie made about the interests of policymakers versus researchable questions, and how you can work together to try and understand what the point is. I mean, and I think there may be areas to learn from other fields as well. We did a lot of work in the medical school working with doctors and nurses and other frontline clinicians who also tended to have questions which started out being, diabetes, what's that all about then? But actually needed support, training, structures, question structures, to think about what populations do you really care about, what interventions, what outcomes, and structured ways of thinking through individual or sets of questions that were actually answerable with different research methods. And I think that, again, might be something that we as a network can think about, those sorts of tools and training to support translating an interest into a researchable question.
Can I just add?
I completely agree,
Quick, this is not a fully formed thought, and I think there'll be people out there who will be able to better talk about this. But I think it's interesting to talk about evidence-informed, evidence-based, or evidence-led policy, but then the constraints about economics or legal and so on. But those are also questions we are trying to challenge. The legal ways of looking at things, whether economics dominate, which perspectives and values, whether they're political or not, are used and how they're used in decision making. So I think this is maybe a particular social science challenge, that it isn't just about providing evidence or what is considered evidence, and work around values and perspectives, is also evidence, but it's much more difficult to get people to view it as evidence or use it in their decision making as evidence.
Thank you very much. I've just been given a time warning, so we have 5 minutes left. And I was wondering whether there are any urgent, burning comments that people would like to make sure we share.
Just to build on that point a little bit in terms of looking at those kind of bigger questions. So I think a fellowship or any other kind of research project looking at government policy can look at the more areas where you can have the immediate impact, the areas where the policymakers might think they want to focus, or you can look at those bigger kind of more structural questions. But that's where your impact is going to be much, much longer term. So I think it's how do you then build in space to value that kind of diffuse impact? You might just be one chip on that big block, if that makes sense, but how do you then kind of capture that? Because it's much easier to say, well, actually, you'd achieve a lot more, potentially, in the short term. You'd achieve a lot more that you can see by focusing on, the more immediate stuff, like why policy aren't engaging with this kind of evidence, because it's not, it's not succinct enough, it's not accessible enough. So I think it's just something to think about, really, in terms of structuring fellows.
It's interesting because that also raises lots of questions about what kind of questions and what kind of impact do you want to have, and there's so many different ways of looking at that. So, and again, we need to co-produce in order to create those questions, really. Yeah, really interesting. I'm just aware that maybe I'll come to you in a sec. Anything from anyone online before we forget all about you?
I can share that paper in our answers
to
these questions.
Beth is going to share the paper.
Thank you.
Okay, then we have a question over here.
Thanks, Brigida. This is just a gentle plea. Economics has come up as a kind of an externality or a barrier, but we need to bear in mind that, economists can be part of the solution here as well. Particularly working with heterodox economists, people interested in ecological economics and social environmental economics. They're on the side of the angels here, and we need to work with them. Instead, it's the ESRC after all.
Fair enough.
I just had one thing to add. I think from a policy and strategy side of things, it's crucial to work with the policy fellows on the research and evidence that they're producing, so that when we go to the ministers to get for political and policy steers, we can kind of use that evidence in the most impactful way. So I think kind of working from the beginning throughout the whole of their policy, their fellowships, in order to produce evidence that we can go to ministers. That's really crucial, and that's going to have the biggest impact in kind of aligning policy and implementing it.
Yeah.
But maybe some of those bigger questions around, the role of structures in big institutions in inhibiting how we use evidence. Ministers are not interested in seeing those. So it comes back to what kind of impact do you want to have, and whether it's short-term or long-term.
Yeah, there's always this question about bottom-up and top-down and quick responses versus playing the long game. I guess we always have to do both, but yeah. Yeah, okay.
Maybe there's, kind of this conversation about impact. I wonder whether, kind of does Access have a role in terms of supporting, researchers, particularly with thinking about how do we document impact, particularly when it's of this more kind of diffuse source. support. And I think we're all too well aware that the likelihood of somebody citing your research and that just being a sort of a simple, oh look, here I've had impact, it's fairly rare that something so straightforward comes along. So yeah, maybe, I don't know, some kind of, I hate to use the word toolkit, but I don't know, some kind of advisory sheet on how we can better evidence impact of the sort that we're describing, and some of the more kind of challenging and long-term impact would be useful, because I think it's the kind of stuff that's important. I think it's rare that we come up with something that's such a nice straightforward thing that minister wants it right, I'll go away and do it, and therefore fantastic, I got the impact I wanted to have. So I think often it is a lot more round the houses and kind of confused and chaotic, as the discussion this morning has suggested. So thinking about how we can properly acknowledge those forms of impact as well would be really helpful. To encourage us all to do it. Otherwise, I guess there's that sense of like, right, I better look for the quick wins then. Why would I bother doing anything challenging? Because I'm not going to get rewarded for that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's actually definitely something that we're looking into in Access to. We actually use the word toolkits as well, but yeah, the idea of different kinds of impact, how do you do what you need to? So that's definitely something that we're looking at and trying to, a lot of things have been written about it already, but to create some sort of helpful, I will call it a toolkit because I can't think of anything else, but you know what I mean. Our time is up, so thank you very much to our panel. It was really, really interesting. So hopefully this inspired lots of people to go and do fellowships or take on fellows and things like that. So yeah, thank you very much. Lunchtime, I think.
I think so.
Excellent.